very specific thoughts about the movie and the part and what worked and didn't work for him. And I think I just nodded and smiled a lot and agreed with everything he said.
In 1990, Pretty Woman became the ultimate Hollywood love story.
Hollywood has always been in the business of selling dreams. But every once in a while, the curtain slips, and what you find behind it is messy, raw, and far more interesting than anything that made it onto the screen. Pretty Woman is one of those films. Released in 1990, it became one of the highest-grossing romantic comedies in cinema history, a glossy fairy tale that audiences around the world embraced with an almost desperate warmth. Julia Roberts' smile became a cultural landmark. Richard Gere's silver hair became the universal symbol of sophisticated romance. The film felt effortless, magical, inevitable. But it wasn't any of those things. Not even close. What audiences never saw, what the studio worked very hard to make sure they would never see, was the chaos, the conflict, the near disasters, and the buried truths that existed just inches outside the camera's frame. There were scenes that were shot and quietly destroyed. There were moments of genuine danger that were repackaged as cinematic charm. There was a poster that lied to the world, an ending that had to be invented from scratch, and a leading lady who was nearly fired before she ever delivered a single line. The Pretty Woman the world fell in love with was, in many ways, a carefully constructed illusion, and the real story is far more fascinating than the fairy tale. So let's talk about what they never wanted you to know. Before a single frame was ever shot, before the iconic red dress existed, before anyone uttered the words Cinderella story, there was a screenplay called 3000, written by J.F. Lawton, and it had absolutely nothing to do with romance. Lawton's original script was a grim, unflinching examination of power and disposability set against the neon-lit underbelly of Los Angeles. Vivian Ward was not a witty, warm-hearted woman waiting to be discovered. She was a woman trapped by poverty, by addiction, by a world that had never once looked at her with any genuine kindness. Edward Lewis, meanwhile, was not a brooding prince in need of emotional awakening. He was cold, transactional, and entirely comfortable with the moral emptiness of what he was doing. The week-long arrangement between them ended not with roses and a balcony, but with an envelope of cash and a car door closing. The script was bleak by design. Lawton wasn't writing escapism. He was writing a mirror. When Disney acquired the rights to the project, the studio issued what amounted to a creative mandate. Transform it. Strip the darkness. Keep the electricity between the two leads, but rebuild the entire moral architecture of the story. What followed was a rewriting process so extensive that the finished film bore almost no thematic resemblance to the original screenplay. Vivian's addiction was erased. The cold ending was replaced. The brutal honesty that Lawton had embedded into every scene was sanded down and lacquered over until what remained was something bright, entertaining, and carefully engineered to make audiences feel good. That transformation is not a secret, but what rarely gets discussed is what was lost in the process, and how close the film came, at multiple points, to collapsing entirely under the weight of its own contradictions. Julia Roberts was 21 years old when she was cast in the original version of the project. Her rawness, her emotional transparency, her complete lack of Hollywood artifice, all of it made her perfect for Lawton's Vivian. But when Disney stepped in and began reshaping the film into a glossy romantic fantasy, executives started looking at Roberts differently. Suddenly, her qualities felt like liabilities. She was too intense, they said, too unpolished. The new version of the film needed someone with the kind of established glamour that Roberts, at that point in her career, simply didn't have on paper. Names were floated. Discussions were held. For a period of several weeks, Roberts was genuinely in danger of losing the role entirely. Director Gary Marshall refused to surrender without a fight. He had seen something in Roberts during the audition process that he was convinced no other actress could replicate. Not just talent, but a specific quality of emotional honesty that made the camera trust her in a way that couldn't be manufactured. He went to bat for her repeatedly, insisting that removing her from the project would fundamentally undermine whatever magic the film was chasing. He won, but the experience left its mark. By the time filming began, Roberts was carrying the knowledge that the very studio financing the film had tried to replace her. She was the lead of a major Hollywood production, and she was also, in a very real sense, still auditioning. That pressure would follow her through nearly every day of the shoot. One of the film's most joyful sequences, Vivian soaking in an enormous bubble bath, singing along without a care in the world, required considerably more suffering to produce than the finished scene suggests. The production design team, determined to create a visually exaggerated foam effect that would hold up under studio lighting for hours, filled the tub with industrial-strength detergent rather than anything designed for human skin. The visual result was precisely what they wanted. The physical result for Roberts was considerably less pleasant. After extended time in the tub, her skin began to react badly to the harsh chemicals. The situation worsened when it became clear that the detergent was actively stripping the dye from her hair, leaving visible discoloration that required the production to halt while her stylist worked to correct it. And then, somewhere in the middle of all that physical discomfort, the crew pulled a prank. During a moment when Roberts was required to submerge her head briefly, everyone on set, cast, crew, director, quietly walked out of the room. When she surfaced, she was completely alone in an empty studio, mid-scene, surrounded by silence. Her genuine shock, followed by an eruption of uncontrollable laughter, was the emotional release valve the production desperately needed at that point in the shoot. What looked like pure, carefree spontaneity was actually something far more complicated. A young woman laughing through exhaustion, chemical burns, and the accumulated weight of everything the preceding weeks had cost her. The jewelry box scene is one of the most replayed moments in the entire film. Edward presents Vivian with a stunning necklace, and as she leans in to admire it, the lid snaps shut on her fingers. Her laugh in response is so genuine, so unguarded, that it feels like a window opening directly into the real person behind the character. What most people don't know is that the moment was entirely unscripted, and that the stakes surrounding it were considerably higher than anyone in the audience could have guessed. The necklace was real. It was a piece on loan from Fred Jolier, valued at over $250,000, and it arrived on set accompanied by armed security personnel, who did not leave the jewelry's side for a single moment during the entire shoot. A jeweler's representative was stationed off-camera during every take, watching with the kind of focused attention that left no room for accidents. When Richard Gere improvised the box snap, a spontaneous decision made on director Gary Marshall's quiet instruction to do something unexpected. He was essentially treating a $250,000 piece of jewelry as a prop in an unplanned physical gag. Had anything gone wrong in that moment, the financial and legal consequences would have been severe. Instead, it produced one of the most purely joyful seconds in the history of the romantic comedy genre. The poster for Pretty Woman is one of the most iconic images in Hollywood marketing history. Julia Roberts in a fitted black dress and thigh-high boots, leaning against Richard Gere, polished, confident, and undeniably glamorous. It sold the film to millions of people before they ever bought a ticket. It is also, in a very specific and deliberate way, a fabrication. The body in that poster does not belong to Julia Roberts. When the marketing team assembled the image, they brought in a professional body double named Donna Scoggins, whose figure better matched the aesthetic the design team was chasing. Scoggins posed for the shoot, and Roberts' face was edited onto the image in post-production. The deception was considered unremarkable within the industry at the time. These kinds of composite images were not uncommon in Hollywood marketing, but it carried a meaning that extended well beyond technical expediency. Here was a film about a woman learning to claim her own identity, advertised to the world with an image that quite literally replaced her body with someone else's. The irony was lost on no one who eventually learned the truth, including Roberts herself, for whom the revelation became a symbol of something she had been pushing against her entire career: the industry's compulsion to reshape women until they fit a pre-existing mold, regardless of the cost. The red gown that Vivian wears to the opera has become one of the most recognizable costumes in film history. It is the visual centerpiece of her transformation. The moment the film makes its argument most forcefully that this woman, dismissed and underestimated by everyone around her, is extraordinary. But the dress very nearly didn't exist in red at all. Costume designer Marilyn Van Straker's initial proposal was met with significant resistance from studio executives who wanted something darker and more conservative. Black, they argued, was sophisticated. Black was safe. Black fit their vision of what the scene should communicate. Vance pushed back. Her argument was not merely aesthetic, it was narrative. Black would make Vivian recede. Red would make her arrive. After a week of debate, screen tests, and considerable back and forth, the red dress survived. When the cameras finally captured Roberts descending the staircase in the finished gown, the crew's reaction confirmed what Vance had known all along. Some creative arguments are won not by persuasion, but by proof. Gary Marshall rewrote the ending of Pretty Woman alone, in his office, with a blank notepad and a clear conviction that the film needed to earn the emotional release it had been building toward. The original screenplay's conclusion, Vivian left on the street with cash, watching a car disappear into traffic, had already been tested and rejected by audiences who found it devastating rather than cathartic. Several intermediate versions had been tried and found equally unsatisfying. What the film needed, Marshall understood, was not just a happy ending, but a specific kind of ending, one that honored both characters' journeys rather than simply resolving the plot. The balcony scene he wrote that night, with its fairy tale imagery and its quietly revolutionary final exchange about who saves whom, achieved something that the earlier drafts had not. It gave Vivian agency. It didn't just rescue her. It made her the architect of her own story. When Marshall pitched it to Roberts the following morning, she reportedly cried before he had even finished reading it. The scene they filmed from those handwritten pages is now one of the most quoted endings in romantic comedy history, born not from a team of studio writers in a conference room, but from one director's instinct about what emotional truth required. None of what Pretty Woman ultimately became would have been possible without understanding what Julia Roberts was actually going through while she was making it. The anxiety she carried during production was not incidental to the film. It was, in a very real sense, the film. The trembling before takes, the panic that surfaced during emotionally intense scenes, the physical toll of carrying a project this size at 21 while knowing the studio had already tried to remove her. All of it went somewhere. It went into Vivian. The bashfulness, the flashes of vulnerability, the moments where Robert's guard seems to drop entirely, and you feel like you're watching something genuinely unmediated. None of it was calculated. It was the real thing, redirected. Gary Marshall understood this, which is why so much of his work on that set was less about directing performances and more about creating conditions where Roberts could exist without being crushed by the pressure surrounding her. He rearranged schedules. He told jokes. He tickled her foot to get a real laugh. He sat beside her on a bed during a moment of paralysis and told her quietly that they could wait. The film that emerged from that process, flawed, dazzling, sometimes contradictory, impossible to forget, was built as much from his patience as from her talent. Pretty Woman has always been sold as a fairy tale, and perhaps it is one. But fairy tales, when you look closely enough, are almost never really about magic. They are about survival, disguised as something prettier. And that, more than anything else, is what this film has always actually been. The credits rolled. The fairy tale ended. But the real story, the one they never wanted you to hear, was always the more interesting one.